So welcome back. Now we're going to talk about something that's, I think, kind of interesting, and that's competitive analysis. Now it's true that we already talked about this in a very broad way with our discussion of the five forces analysis, but that's really a very abstract way of looking at your competition. If you actually want to survive in the competitive environment, you have to do more than just draw a five forces model on a board, right? So competitors analysis is very, very important. And it's done on a continuous basis by everyone in a firm, or at least it should be. And the reason you do it is you want to get extensive information about your competition and predict their behavior. If you know what the competition is doing, then you can either beat them to the punch or you can try a completely different strategy. So it's important, first of all, to understand your rival. First of all, look at their strategy. How is the firm actually competing? And you can use any of the tools that I've already given you so far in this class as a way to understand your rivals, right? So you can look at the strategy. You can look at their objectives. What are their current goals? Is their performance meeting their goals? How likely is it that their goals are going to change? Now, when you think about it, you could probably look up financial data and get some sort of a understanding of this. Look at Standard & Poor's, look at general market trends. Right? And this is available, or Value Line. These are all great sources for that kind of information. You can look at their assumptions. What assumptions does a competitor hold about the industry and itself? And you can sense that indirectly by their actions. And what are your competitors' key strengths and weaknesses? Now, probably they're not going to say what those things are, but you can always look at investment analyst reports to get some of that information. Okay? Now, use all that kind of stuff that I just mentioned together, and you can use that to make predictions. So what strategy changes, for example, would a competitor take? It's one thing you can look at. And how would the competitor possibly respond to your own firm's strategic initiatives? Now, some other sources of competitive intelligence. Of course, it can be bought, okay? And that's directly or indirectly. This is one of the key things that strategy consultants do, right? If you read DiMaggio and Powell's article on isomorphism, he describes one of the things that strategy consultants do is they're like honeybees, right? Honeybees go from flower to flower spreading pollen, while consultants go from firm to firm spreading the best practices, right? So by using strategy consultants, you can kind of figure out what the other firms are doing, whether they tell you that directly or not. But it is something that you should generate internally all the time. And you can do that by using your common stakeholders, right? You can look at your common suppliers. What do the suppliers say about your rivals? What do the clients say about your rivals? What does the media say about your rivals? What do people that have come from other firms or left those other firms say about your rivals? Now, of course, they're not supposed to divulge that information. That's when you start getting into unethical practices. They're not supposed to divulge information about a competitor, typically. I'm not saying that it's not done, though. Okay? So look at your stakeholders and see which stakeholders you have in common with your rivals and see if you can get information from them about that. Of course, you also hear stories about dumpster diving and all this other stuff. I don't recommend that. However, I am not saying that it doesn't happen. So when you want to, kind of going back to the first five things four things we looked at, what is their strategy, what is their objectives, their assumptions, and their resources and capabilities. Trying to understand their strategy in a holistic way is so important. And everything is of interest. Everything should be looked at. Look at what are their investments in research and development. What are their production sites? What kind of advertising are they using? The advertising is important to understand the message that they want to portray to the public. Okay? What kind of products do they currently have in their production pipeline or their sales pipelines? Draw their stakeholder map. Okay? Who are their potential partners? Who are their clients? Who are their distributors? Their suppliers? Are they making any acquisition projects? Of course, you can always find out about that in the financial news. Not only how many people are they hiring, but what kinds of people with what kinds of skill sets are they hiring? Also very important. And what is their cost structure for the activities that they're currently doing? Of course, just because a firm says something in a press release doesn't necessarily mean it's true. That's something that they want the public to think. So I wouldn't necessarily fall into a trap and assume automatically that media announcements or everything on their investors' relation website is necessarily true at all. And of course, those of you that are more quantitatively inclined can build a graph to try to understand their economies of scale, their cost and experience curves. It's certainly possible. And you can use, of course, competitors, more than one competitor's costs on the same graph to try to get an understanding of how much an unknown competitor's costs might be, or at least come up with some sort of a range. That's also a possibility. So you can look at industry averages and then kind of apply that to a potential competitor's. Of course, you also need to identify the competitor's goals, right? How fast does a competitor want to grow? How profitable do they want to be? What are their short-term and long-term results? What about their corporate social responsibility plans? And that's one way to at least get a little bit of their budget, right? Because you can kind of figure out how much they're donating, right? And even if that's only 5% of their budget, that's at least 5% of the budget that you know, and then you can focus on the other 95% that you don't know. Looking at their corporate governance. Compare their stock price. Are they a potential target for acquisition? Of course, looking at governance also, a family-owned firm would behave very differently than one that is publicly traded. Looking at a firm, if they're getting ready to do an IPO, that would be important to know. Is the firm part of a diversified group, or do they belong to like a holding company? Things you might want to consider. If a firm is making a lot of recent investments, they may become more aggressive. And are there any sort of crises or disruptions that would impact their goals? Is their profit deteriorating? Are they undergoing litigation? Are there any political tensions? Do they have a new CEO? Those are all things you'd want to consider. Also, you need to understand what their assumptions of the industry are. You know, what kind of scenarios are they building? How do they build their strategic group map? What do they think their recipe for success is? And the funny thing is, if a competitor has a firm strategy or a firm recipe for success, they may stick to that in spite of any adversity that they may be facing, because they consider it as the root of their past successes. Finally, you need to identify a competitor's resources and capabilities. Okay? Helps you understand the seriousness of any potential challenges to your firm. So you can look at things like financial data. That's pretty easy to come up with. Okay? Look at the financial data to understand their resources. Understand, again, looking at their stakeholders, understanding their strengths and weaknesses as described by their stakeholders. And, of course, you need to understand and correctly assess the strengths of the rivals. What are the chances of survival against new entrants versus incumbents is also something that you want to take into account. So in our next video, we're going to do also another one of my favorite things, and we're going to look at strategic group analysis. Looking forward to seeing you then.